The real issue is when politicians make policy for energy and political time, they're thinking in 2-year and 4-year political cycles. What will help me in the next 2 years? What will help me in the next 4 years? When energy officials think about energy projects, they think in terms of decades. I think it is appropriate to start with the BP spill because this is a very serious issue. It's not going away anytime soon. I think we need 3 perspectives on it at a minimum. One perspective is to find out what actually happened. What was it that out of 35,000 successfully drilled wells in the Gulf of Mexico led this particular well to turn into a blowout where we have never in 40 years of successful and sustainable development of the Gulf of Mexico faced this kind of a situation? It is every oil company's worst nightmare to have a geographically high-risk operation go totally badly wrong, contrary to every engineering plan, every equipment design plan, and we have to find out who made what decisions in what time frame that led to this catastrophe and the deaths of 11 people, the loss of $1 billion rig, and the impact on the coastal region, which, as you may know, does not have beaches. There are no beaches for the oil to roll up on. This is wetland, this is coastland, this is marshland. And if you've ever been out there, you can see how vulnerable it is to the ravages of nature, let alone man-made ravage, which this is. The second perspective, I think, is very important, and that is, what about the cleanup? What about shutting off the flow, and how about the cleanup? We can find out who did what in perspective number 1 over time. People will have to declare themselves under oath to tell the truth. But what about stopping the flow, and what about the cleanup? Stopping the flow is a critically important endeavor. If you rush it, it will go wrong. We're talking about parallel engineering of multiple remedies simultaneously. BP from the first instance, and everybody in the industry has a crisis plan. Their crisis plan said get the right people in a room, suspend normal chain of command, bring in the best minds that can be brought in from wherever in the world they may be, bring in the experience of the industry. All this has been happening. Within 24 hours, they had 1,000 people assigned to the crisis team to begin working on a litany of parallel remedies to stop the flow. And it started with the robots trying to activate the blowout preventer. That was the first remedy that was attempted. It didn't work. 2 or 3 days were lost trying to make that happen. Then right down the list after another. The chimney stack, the top hat, the insertion, the top kill, the junk shot. And there are still other remedies that are in train, that are being worked, but you can't rush the engineering. It's not just the engineering of the idea, it's also organizing the equipment that you need and making sure that the equipment that you're going to use, whether it's the pipes that have to be threaded, that have to have manufactured parts to the end of it to be able to connect to something. All of this is being done in real time, and I'm not saying this is to excuse the delay in shutting off the flow. I'm just trying to describe that this is complicated engineering design, equipment design, and then you need a logistics management plan, and then you need to test the ideas against the smart people who are there as official critics of what ideas are being considered, and then you have to practice the execution of it. You have to realize you're 5,000 feet away. Everything is done remote control. Everything is done by experienced operators who are using a joystick to basically do what they do. And the currents are always moving your robots about. So you're trying to stabilize the robots while you're trying to tighten bolts or measure parts for connecting valves or connecting threads and so forth. And so it just is time consuming to do this the right way. Cleaning up I think the cleanup is probably what is most offensive to the people on the coast and to the American people as they see this crude oil floating. They see planes flying over with dispersant. The dispersant is chemically active. It is a hydrocarbon itself. It's deadly to marine life. But it does break up the oil. There are those who say they shouldn't be using dispersants. I happen to be anti-dispersant because of the knock-on effects of, it's like pouring kerosene on crude oil. And I would rather see biomass poured on that crude oil, peat moss, straw, wood chips, you name it, so that it could actually be collected and burned more easily than just the dispersants trying to break it up. And you see it eventually rolling into places you would never want to see oil come to. There's controversy, and I think that the controversy goes to the fact that we have not had much experience with spills like this. If we face the hurricane season, it's going to get even worse. June 1st is the start of hurricane season. Generally, we don't have hurricanes in June, but we could. It's happened in the past, which would bring a seawall of water forward, bringing all that oil inland by miles, because that's what walls of water actually do. So the urgency is there. I've been on the airwaves for the last several weeks offering the idea, which happened in the Arabian Gulf 20 years ago, with a larger spill than this spill, which was never reported. Different form of government, different role of the media, but a huge spill off the coast of Saudi Arabia in the Arabian Gulf, where supertankers were deployed in formation. Supertankers which hold 1 million barrels of liquid, with huge pumps and large valves and pipes extended from the supertankers into the water to suck in water and oil. And I came across this idea from a couple of engineers wandering through the Offshore Technology Conference in Houston. They have been trying to get a voice. I've been trying to help them have a voice. And so with my ability to connect with people, people know who I am, and I said it on Brian Williams tonight. It'll be broadcast in a few minutes. I said it on Dylan Radigan. I'll say it later again, but I've been saying it on TV, on the Today Show, several weeks ago, but we don't seem to be getting a reaction from the government, and that's a serious issue. And I hope it's not NIH, not invented here syndrome. I hope it's just not a bureaucracy that's afraid to make a decision because they might embarrass themselves. BP's been looking at the technical aspects of it, but had to really push for that to occur. But the cleanup is part, and the stopping of the flow is a very important second perspective. The third perspective is, where do we go from here? Where does the nation's energy policy proceed from here? And here's a question that every American should be asking himself or herself and come to a conclusion, and this gets me right into the heart of the book. The question is, why are we in the deep water? Why are we taking risk to drill and to produce oil at 5,000, 8,000, 10,000 feet below the surface of the sea, with wells that go 20,000, 25,000, 35,000 feet into the earth, with all the risks associated? Well, there's a reason why we're in the deep water. It is the only part of the offshore outer continental shelf that the oil companies are allowed to go by virtue of government policy. 85% of the outer continental shelf has been off limits for over 30 years. We have been importing our oil. 40 years ago, we imported 30% of our oil. Last year, we imported 65% of our oil, while producing less and less, but sequestering our oil production offshore in the western Gulf of Mexico, when there are prolific reserves of oil onshore, on federal lands. Shallow water offshore, East Coast, West Coast, Alaska, Eastern Gulf of Mexico, that the companies cannot touch. In shallow water, if you have a problem, you solve it with divers, not robots. Divers who have the equipment and the wherewithal and the knowledge and the judgment right there on the spot to make decisions. You have access. For this top kill project, you're going to have a pipe 5,000 feet long from the surface of the barges and the ships, pumping heavy mud, drilling mud, down 5,000 feet of pipe through a connection into the blowout protector, hoping that the integrity of the blowout protector will withstand the pressure of the mud. It's a high-risk operation, probably 50-50 chance of success. Perhaps it will work, but nobody knows. Never been done. But why are we in the deep water? Which gets me to the point of my book, why we hate the oil companies. The oil companies are like every other company in the world. They have a job to do. Their job is to produce energy. Let's extend it to the utilities, the power plants. They have a job to do, produce energy. That's what they do. They produce energy with the science and the technology and the engineering and the raw materials of whatever the source of energy is. Natural gas, coal, oil, nuclear, wind, solar, biofuels, whatever the source of energy might be. They produce energy. That's their job. Because in this country particularly, more so than in any other country in the world, we have politicized energy for short-term political gain. And whether it's the Republican administration or the Democratic administration, a Republican-controlled Congress or a democratically controlled Congress, we have tolerated as citizens our elected officials choosing those energy initiatives and those energy ideas which they believe will be successful in getting them votes for their election campaigns. So if you want to be anti-coal, you want to be anti-oil, you want to be anti-hydrocarbon, you have a party that you can affiliate with to pursue your notion of anti-hydrocarbon. If you want to be pro-wind or pro-solar or pro-biofuels, you have a party that stands for that. If you want to be pro-oil, pro-coal, pro-affordability, pro-availability, you have a party that you can affiliate with. We're the only country in the world that turns energy choice into election decisions. Politicians have figured out how to make that happen. I ran into it head on with $4 gasoline. There was no reason on God's earth that gasoline in this country should have cost $4 a gallon at the time that it did. Because there was no reason that crude oil should have gotten to $147 a barrel the way it did. It happened because the world was stuck at 85 million barrels a day in 2007 and 2008. The economy of the world was strong. There was more demand for more crude oil than there was crude oil available. That's what drives the price up. But something else happened in 2008 to spike the price. Little known fact, it's in the book. It's the story of how did we get from the low 100s to $147 in a matter of just a few months. Elected officials said, oh, it's the speculators. The speculators driving the price so they can make cash money off of price rising. No. There's always speculation in the oil price. It comes out to about 5%. The best anybody can figure of oil price is the speculative notion, up or down, give or take, high or low, 5%. What was driving the spiking of the oil price in the first 6 months of 2008 was an event. An event that took place in August of 2008 on the other side of the earth. China had the Olympics. China could not handle, would not tolerate, would not stand for Olympic athletes refusing to run their races or to perform as athletes because of bad air. And everybody knows China's air is probably the worst on earth. And China knows it as well. Because of the threat to the Olympics of foul air causing athletes to refuse to participate, China began a multi-year process of installing diesel generators, diesel fuel-powered generators, to handle electricity supply to critical institutions like hospitals, government offices, and other locations around the northern part around Beijing. So that if the air was so bad that they had to shut down manufacturing and shut down power production from coal plants, they could nonetheless produce emergency energy supplies to critical institutions. They were cornering the market on diesel. Now, when you refine a crude oil barrel, there's only so much of that barrel that can be produced as diesel, about a third. The only way you can get more diesel into the market is to have more crude barrels, because you're only going to get a third of the barrel produced as diesel or aviation fuel. It's in the same family. There weren't enough new barrels coming onto the market to produce the amount of diesel that China needed to meet its inventory requirements for the Olympics. And so that drove the crude oil price. And I tell that story in the book. And I say in the book, did anybody notice after the Olympics, the oil price cratered? That's exactly what happened. The oil price cratered. The issue for this country is that the politics of energy have taken over the energy policy of the future. And I'm here to tell you that most of the energy executives in this country are of the same mind. I'm reporting it. I'm telling the story. This nation is headed within the decade for an unprecedented, never before experienced energy abyss. We will not have sufficient electrons, we will not have sufficient liquid fuel to keep the economy going as we know it. By 2018, 2020 at the latest, we will be in gas lines, we will be rationing. Gasoline will be somewhere north of $6 to $8 a gallon when you can get it. Worse than that, certain densely populated parts of the nation, which for the last nearly 40 years have been living off the legacy of their existing power generation, distribution, and transmission systems, will simply find they don't have enough electrons. And to save the grid from destroying itself when demand pull gets too extreme, the utilities will have to shut down the grid. That means no power. That means lights out for however long until they can safely restore the grid. That will primarily happen in winter months and in summer months when the demand is highest. How can I say all this as truth? Well, just do some back of the envelope calculations. Our population has continued to grow, and it's not going to stop growing. And we don't want it to stop growing. That's not who we are as a people. In the last 5 years, we've canceled plans to build 100 coal plants. They're not going to be built. The average age of coal plants is now 38 years. 10 years on from now, with no new coal plants being built, the average age will be 48 years. Oh, but in the meantime, we'll pass a carbon management plan that will make keeping old coal plants going far more expensive for the utilities. What will utilities do in the interest of their shareholders? Close those plants, because they can't afford to invest in cleaning up the effluent from the plants. More simple to just close it and not spend millions and millions of more dollars on a plant that's 50 years old. Only makes common sense. We haven't built a new nuclear plant in over 20 years. The licenses for nuclear plants run out at 40 years. The average age of nuclear plants is more than 30 years. So in 10 years from now, we will be decommissioning nuclear plants right and left, because otherwise local residents will say, I don't want to live near a 40-year-old nuclear plant. The license is expired. Shut it down. We're not going to build a new nuclear plant in the next decade. The loan guarantee program notwithstanding, because the loan guarantee is simply a promise of something happening. We have yet to permit. We have yet to figure out our nuclear waste disposal strategy as a nation. Although 20 years ago, Congress passed a law to build Yucca Mountain, and Yucca Mountain was built. Sam Bodman told me personally, December 2008. One of the things he wanted to accomplish before the end of the George W. Bush administration was to start the method of getting the permits approved for Yucca Mountain. 8 weeks into the Bush administration, the new Energy Secretary, Stephen Chu, said, we're canceling any plans to permit Yucca Mountain. Where is Yucca Mountain? Oh, it's in Nevada. What's happening in Nevada in 2010? Oh, the majority leader is running for re-election. And the polls show him somewhere in the 20% range. Maybe if he can tell the people of Nevada that we got rid of Yucca Mountain, even though Congress passed a law and a former president signed it into law by administrative decree, we're overturning a law of the land to throw a political bone to a long-serving senator who's having a tough re-election campaign. And now we don't have a nuclear waste storage plan for the nation. So electricity from coal plants, electricity from nuclear plants is a great risk. We are investing in wind, we are investing in solar, with a goal to double it and double it again. Problem is, our baseline from starting is 2% of our energy supply. So if we double our wind and solar supply of electricity, we get all the way to 4% of our electricity supply coming from those renewable sources. If we double it again, we get all the way to 8%. But that will not make up for the decline of energy production coming from abandoned coal plants and decommissioned nuclear plants. And natural gas, which is prolific, is still a hydrocarbon and will be impacted by any carbon management plan, should be impacted by any carbon management plan. So the notion of building out a whole new energy infrastructure, the Pickens plan, is at risk because it is a hydrocarbon. And secondly, the reason we have so much natural gas suddenly discovered is not because we only found out it's there. We've known for decades it's there. What's different is we have a technology called hydraulic fracturing. Hydraulic fracturing creates explosions underground, shatters the rock. If you live on top of that shattered rock, might you worry about subsidence of your property? The reason the rock shatters is that chemicals mixed with sand and water are forced into the pipe with 35,000 horsepower of force to cause an explosion where little grommets come off the pipe and blow it into the sand. What happens to those chemicals? Well, they're supposed to be recovered. You pump it in and you pump it out. Well, do you get it all? Or does some light stay behind? Sort of depends how quickly you try to recover it and whether you get it all or not. What happens to the chemicals that remain? Well, there's water underground. And that water can now move through the cracked rock into other geologic areas. And you hear anecdotal stories of wells turning into methane wells in rural Pennsylvania. Roughly 14 houses a year now explode in areas where there didn't used to be house explosions. The Earth is a moving, vital, dynamic body. Is natural gas the solution? Well, I think it's a partial solution. But let's get to the real issue. The real issue is when politicians make policy for energy and political time, they're thinking in 2-year and 4-year political cycles. What will help me in the next 2 years? What will help me in the next 4 years? When energy officials think about energy projects, they think in terms of decades. 20, 30, 40, 50 years. They can't imagine doing something in political time that has to be done in energy time. And the two parties can't communicate. I personally had 6 congressional testimonies as president of Shell. I may as well talk to a brick wall. There was no interest in the supply dynamics or the technologies or the other kinds of longer-term issues I was describing in the interest of the nation and the interests of the affordability of energy. I was basically not listened to. I'll say that politely. Meanwhile, we have no short, medium, or long-term plan for the nation for energy. And so what I'm saying is that with an executive branch of the federal government that has 13 discrete agencies governing energy and the environment, which don't necessarily work with or talk to each other. Each have their own governance responsibilities commissioned by Congress, with 26 congressional committees and subcommittees that are independently setting energy law into motion, with chairmen who may change every 2 years because of the electoral cycle, and with the judiciary, where every circuit court in the nation can make policy from the bench. There is nobody looking out for the future energy of the nation over a sustained short, medium, long-term plan. We have precedent in this country for this kind of a problem before. In the 19th century, we had a monetary system out of control. Nobody ran it. There was no authority to run the monetary system, that is the money supply, the interest rates, and so forth. The terminology, keep your money in your mattress, was invented in that period. In 1907, those of you from the financial district will remember that J.P. Morgan and his colleagues on Wall Street bailed out the U.S. Treasury. It was in default. Of course, everybody in Washington said, well, thank you very much, that'll never happen again. We'll fix that problem. Well, it happened again in 1912. Again, Wall Street bailed out the U.S. Treasury, kept it floating. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed. And from 1913 to the present, no nation on earth has had the monetary stability of the United States of America. No nation on earth has grown its economy in the manner in which the United States of America has grown its economy. An independent regulatory commission was established by an act of Congress with the president's signature to create a board of governors, a board of experts who know what they're doing, to operate with 14-year terms, not 2-year terms or 4-year terms, but to operate with 14-year terms in order to provide the nation monetary leadership. It's not perfect because it's run by human beings. And so mistakes made in the 1930s, we paid a price for that. Mistakes made between 2003 or 4 and 2008 or 9, we're paying a price for that still, right now. Human mistakes, not legal mistake, not a mistake of the law, but a mistake of the judgment of the governors. But those are two primary examples, but we recovered from both because we had a Fed. I'm suggesting that the only way we have an energy future that we can count on, where availability, affordability, and sustainability has to be governed by an independent regulatory agency. I call it the Federal Energy Resources Board. A law passed by Congress, signed by a president, establishing a board of governors who know what they're doing, who do 4 things. Manage the future of our energy supply according to the types of energy we have available with a 50-year time horizon. How much hydrocarbon? How much renewable? How much nuclear? How much hydropower? How much geothermal? How much of all the forms of energy supply our energy system? Second, make the tough technology decisions that no one else will make to use energy more efficiently. Example, get rid of the internal combustion engine. It's 100 years old. It's 20% efficient, which means you put $100 in your gas tank, $20 gives you mobility, $80 wasted as heat. It's not an efficient machine. Get rid of it. We have hydrogen fuel cell technology. We have battery technology. There are alternatives to the internal combustion engine, which will still enable us to live a mobile lifestyle, and an affordable mobile lifestyle, because the price is going to be where we can afford it. Make those big technology decisions. Thirdly, govern the environmental footprint of energy. Don't let Congress do it. Don't let the administration do it. I mean, let's be blunt. On January the 19th, 2008, was carbon dioxide endangering the American people? Not according to the Bush administration. 8 weeks later, Lisa Jackson, the newly appointed EPA administrator, with a new administration that took over on January 20th, 2009, determined that the public comment period would start whether to determine that carbon dioxide is indeed endangering the American people. Was there new science? Was there a new study? Was there new evidence? No. There was a change in the political governance of the country. So we go from non-endangerment to endangerment because someone else is chosen as president. Is that how we run this country? Political choice determines the future of our society, where science might have something to say about this? I don't give credit to either administration. They both politicized it. I have a chapter called Beware the Reckless Right and the Ludicrous Left. The right will destroy our earth, the left will destroy our society, because they are both interested in their own preservation, their own glorification. That's not what should govern the energy system that we count on as an economic engine for the economy that keeps the equilibrium of society harmonious, that gives us the lifestyles that we've chosen to live high up in high-rise buildings. If the blackout happened now, it'd be a long walk down, folks. Sorry about that. But those of you who live in this city have the most fear for blackouts. You've been through them. You know what it's like.
Yeah.
What if they happen repeatedly, several times a month? What would the grocery stores do? They'd stop carrying frozen food because they can't rely upon the electricity to keep the food frozen. And they can't afford to, they have about 8 hours without their freezers operating when they have to condemn the food. You can't afford to condemn the food very often. So an independent regulatory agency can govern this with common sense and pragmatism over time. And the fourth governance responsibility is to make sure that the regional and interstate infrastructure is equal to the task. New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. Serious, serious old age problem in the electricity infrastructure. Robert Moses built it, for Pete's sakes. And every time the utilities in this region try to do something new or different, they're stopped. Stopped in their tracks. I tell the story of trying to put a liquefied natural gas regasification facility in Long Island Sound. I had Bloomberg with me. I actually had privately all of the congressional delegates from this region, except Congressman Bishop, in whose region this, actually it wasn't in this region because it was in the middle of Long Island Sound, the project. I had everybody lined up, provided the governor would agree. The governor was on the verge of agreeing, Governor Spitzer, and he resigned. And he was replaced by Governor Patterson. Now, I briefed Lieutenant Governor Patterson. He knew the story, but with 30 days under his belt, and environmentalists and local residents of the eastern part of Long Island screaming at him, "Don't let Shell do this," he vetoed it for political purposes, to make friends with people he felt he needed as friends, and he didn't need Shell as a friend. I understand that. But do the people of Long Island, do the people of New York have new energy supply? That would have been the first new energy supply to this region in 30 years. And it's not going to happen. I appealed it to the Department of Commerce, which could overrule the governor. But in the remaining days of the Bush administration, Secretary Gutierrez let it sit on his desk. Secretary Locke took over. Within 2 weeks of being confirmed, he killed it. So Long Island, no new gas. We can't let politics decide our future of energy. Final point. Because I say so, because the book says it, and I hope a lot of people will read it across the country, does that mean it's going to happen? Does that mean the government will suddenly say, yes, let's have an independent regulatory agency. Let's we congressmen, give up our authority to set energy policy and give it to an independent board of governors? No. It's dead on arrival in Washington, D.C. with the incumbent elected officials. How do I know? I've tested it. I've tried it on many senators and many members of the administration and many House members. They change the subject. This will never work. I've tried it with the associations, the lobbyists. Oh, John, you don't understand Washington. This will never work. Why would anybody currently elected give up their prerogative and their power to support your idea. Then they can't run on a campaign of more energy this way or that way. They can't do more baby drill, or they can't plead no more coal, because it's not within their gift any longer. They've given that up. Dead on arrival is not good enough. So the book ends by suggesting to the citizens of the country that it's time for the governed to remind the governing who's actually in charge of the nation, and to turn the trend of misinformation, disinformation, and lack of information on its head, so that the American people say, over a period of educated years, this isn't working. Now, I plead for a rational, progressive movement in this direction because we're smart and we're practical and we can figure this out. But I say in the end, if pragmatic, rational thinking doesn't make it happen, the energy abyss will. We will not stand still as a nation accepting a life of third world energy treatment with blackouts and brownouts and gas lines. We just won't. So we could move sooner or we could move later. My advocacy is to move out now. So thank you very much for listening.
We're going to open up to questions. We're going to run some microphones out to those people in the audience who want to raise their hands. But why don't I start us off while you all think of your questions? If you would comment on what has happened so far in terms of what changes have ostensibly been made to some sort of regulation here in terms of the MMS, the Mineral Management the service there, in terms of what the Interior Secretary has said he wants to do, because just as recently as today, I had a lawyer from Legal Defense Fund, Earth Justice, come out and say he's not suing BP, he's suing the government, he's suing MMS for not doing their job in terms of disclosing these worst case scenarios.
I think when you are grasping at straws, you will grasp at any straw you can. MMS is not a perfect regulatory agency, but too much is being made of the so-called cozy relationship between the agency and the industry. I will not deny that there were some episodes, some escapades that took place in Colorado on an isolated basis between some independent oil companies and some young staff of the MMS. They had some parties on the western slope. Now, if you've ever been to the western slope of Colorado, there's not much else to do. You can hunt game or you can hunt men or women, but there's not a lot else to do. Now, I'm not forgiving that. I looked at it from a Shell standpoint. Did any employees of Shell have anything to do with these escapades that were taking place? And what I got back was, look, this was an isolated set of events. The people all got fired. This was 2006. This is 2010. Why are we still dealing with these old chestnuts when the problem was solved as soon as it came to attention? Well, I don't think the leadership of the government really knows what happens inside MMS. They're grasping at straws and they're blaming someone for the fact that they don't know. I was turned down on project after project by Sam Bodman, by Gail Norton, by Carlos Gutierrez, Conrad Lautenbacher, a number of other people at other levels because they didn't think we had done enough on the environmental impact statement. This was the Bush administration, the pro-industry oil president. I have found that the MMS, the Commerce Department, NOAA, are tough. They take their jobs seriously. And whether you're appointed by a Republican president or a Democratic president, that is a special privilege that you have a responsibility to the people of America. Are there individuals that might have gone a little to the other side, or leaned this way or leaned that way, gone lax on this or lax on that? I used to get complaints from managers in the Gulf of Mexico saying, we're falling behind on such and such a project because the inspections are slowing us down. The rigs that we had, I can't speak for the entire industry, maybe it's because we were a Dutch company, and I don't think that's the case, I'm being somewhat facetious, we had inspectors all the time. And they did their jobs thoroughly. And we would either be written up or we'd get a clean bill of health. I think a lawsuit is going to waste a lot of time and money, because I think these agencies, by and large, do their jobs. Can you find an exception? Yes. Is the exception the rule? Absolutely not. But it's a way of deferring the conversation and casting blame somewhere else. Make the industry look bad. And so I think that this will be a lot of spinning, a lot of smoke, but no fire. And I just think that's just the political process taking over, unfortunately. Mary?
I was wondering, in light of just what you said, I've been reading that not just Obama, but the Bush group before had a lot of people who are sort of civil service people, but they've been in these positions for a long time, and when the oil companies would apply for drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, they didn't really examine it or look at it, and they just said, go ahead and do it. So how can you expect any help from the government if people act like that?
Yeah, again, I think there are anecdotes that would say that these things happened. I went through the summer of 2006, 2007, and 2008, spending over $100 million each summer, waiting for environmental permit approval to do experimental test drilling off the coast of Alaska. Wasted $300 million, never got the permits because they weren't satisfied with the environmental impact statement. This was the Bush administration. And so I had a different experience, and I'm telling my truth, which is these guys were tough. And we're almost there in August. You know, you have a drilling season in Alaska that goes from July 4th until October 15th, roughly. That's the only ice-free time that you have to drill. You can't drill on ice. That's not allowed. So we needed the open water. We needed the permit within a certain window. We gave the government our permit application the previous September for the next summer. They have a 60-day statutory limit on approving the permit. The 60-day statutory limit was exceeded every year. So do we sue to get it? Well, that just ties it up in court. Instead, we would try to work with them to say, what else do you need? What else do you need? We really want to get this done. And we have a time limit on our leases. Leases expire within a few years. These were 5-year leases, as I recall. Maybe no, 10-year leases. But time runs on. We never got the permit until 1 year. We got it 2 weeks before October 15th. 2 weeks. And the weather was horrible, so we just canceled the season. $100 million gone. So there are, for the stories of abuse, I think that there are equal number, and I think actually greater number. If you talk to Exxon or Chevron or Shell or Conoco, just leave BP out of it, I think they will all tell you stories like I'm telling you. Because the government's tough. They should be. They should hold the industry accountable. Same with coal mining. Same with nuclear plant inspections and so on. Can mistakes get made? Yes. Hydrocarbon is dangerous. Whether it's coal, oil, or gas, it's dangerous stuff. And there are risks associated. Anyone else?
In your opinion, what is the impact of the BP spill on long-term offshore drilling?
I think that the current administration will go through an extraordinary foot-dragging process to avoid any decisions on the future of drilling before 2012. I suspect that there will not be any major drilling activity, new drilling, not already approved drilling, but new drilling before the 2012 election, and then depending on the gas price at the 2012 election, it will either be opened up or it won't. I think the gas price will determine a lot about the future of offshore drilling, and when it's under $3 and nobody's really complaining, it's a quiet time. And so why drill? Well, eventually it catches up with you. The BP explosion doesn't have any impact on gas prices for years to come because it's not that big a well to start with. BP was planning to shut it in to hold it for future production, not near-term production. They didn't need it to meet their goals and objectives, so they were going to shut it in. So it was not part of the needed inventory for the next year, 2 years, 3 years. And there are other wells shut in like that because right now there's a glut of oil in the US marketplace. But I think over the longer term, if you're looking out to 2016, 2020, this will be a major setback because people will simply be afraid of it. The 35,000 successful wells don't count. The one unsuccessful well counts unfortunately for everything. And it would take a brave and courageous leader to go against the forces of anti-drilling to say we're going to drill anyway. Particularly when that leader is politically supported, follow the money from the environmentalists, the money from a lot of anti-hydrocarbon people tends to flow to the Democratic Party. Why would they offend their funders by new drilling? Yes, sir. At the end here.
I cannot judge, I have no at all knowledge from technical point of view. But for me, you sound absolutely convincing when you talk about political influence on decision making. But that's not just about oil, that's about everything: finance, healthcare, military, war. And it seems to me it brought us very close to question about democracy, if it works, if political approach works in general. And when you say political attitude of people, people cannot make judgment. Latest event prove that even expert, Nobel Prize are unable to predict development of events, at least in finance. So that's much broader question.
I think it goes to the real issue of how informed is the electorate. An uninformed electorate and an electorate that doesn't participate in the voting process is going to get what it gets. I'm sorry to say I think this country is in a current state of experience that we get what we get because A, the electorate's not involved, and B, the electorate's uninformed or misinformed. The primary election in Pennsylvania, 22% of turnout for the Democratic Party. Mayoral election in Houston, 16% turnout to elect the mayor of Houston in 2009. We had a big turnout for the 2008 election, but it was kind of a dramatic, exciting time with a very different mindset of the electorate. But the real decisions get made in the primaries or in the off-year elections when there's not a presidential choice, when all kinds of people are still running for office. So I think the problem is not democracy. To me, the problem is an uninformed and uninvolved electorate that we all have a responsibility for. Parents to their children, corporate leaders to their employees, community leaders to their citizens, to figure out how to do this better and differently. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Hi. Since we're in the topic of information or lack thereof of information when it comes to oil production, I feel like only now with the oil spill there's been much more attention of the media, especially in the mainstream media, on the bureaucracy and the problems with oil production and the oil companies. Now my question is, only now we're getting so much more information than before with all the problems. How can the civil society be more involved, and how can they push the oil companies to actually do the right thing? And my next question is, since you focus more on the oil production on a national level, but you have the rise of other global superpowers such as China, which makes the race for energy extraction much more challenging for the United States. Where does the United States stand now in the race for energy extraction from other countries, and how is that going to develop in terms of dependency in terms of energy?
In the book, I do address the fact that our oil production is in decline in this country as the world needs ever more energy. So we've gone from 10 million barrels a day production to 7. It could drop to 5 by 2016. Meanwhile, the world needs more energy. So where is it going to come from? Well, if the US doesn't produce more of its own domestic resources, we are contributing to the problem. We have the oil reserves. If we're not producing them, we're creating another problem for ourselves, but also for the rest of the world. China is not going to let up its economic drive for growth. It cannot grow without additional hydrocarbon production. For all their wind towers and for all their solar farms, they are still building and commissioning a new coal plant every week in China. They're still contracting for ever more millions of barrels of oil a year to feed the 10 million new cars that are sold on the highways of China now every year. So we are in a race for resources is what it comes down to. The near-term consequence is high price. High price is a serious problem for those on fixed income or low income or no income. So if we tolerate high prices as a nation rather than produce our own domestic resources in the next 10 or 20 years, we're going to see social disequilibrium in this country and tensions increase dramatically. And if we only point the fingers at the oil companies as the problem, we're really going to hurt ourselves. We're going to see gas stations torched in this country. The bigger issue, though, is what about the long-term future? We cannot live forever on a hydrocarbon base. Hydrocarbon is an expendable form of energy. Once you use it, it's gone. And it is a finite resource, not infinite. So how do we progress from a hydrocarbon economy holistically as a society, not just as a nation, but as a world, towards new and different forms of energy? I maintain in the book we have more energy on this earth than we will ever need. There's 10 basic forms of energy. We have to figure out technologically how to develop those forms of energy we're underutilizing while diminishing our demand for the forms of energy we are utilizing. So I argue for a 50-year transition to a new energy system where in the 0 to 10-year time frame we do more of what we are doing today. We have to. That's the infrastructure we have. But we begin the transition process over the medium term, which is 10 to 25 years, to different ways of using energy and the development of new forms of energy that will feed our future. And then in the long term, the 25-year plus time frame, we do even more of that. So by 2060, we have diminished the use of hydrocarbons to a fraction of what it is today without the disequilibrium that would come from the no more coal crowd who say, let's have no more coal plants within 10 years. That's an absurdity. 600 coal plants shut down in 10 years? That's 60 plants a year. Where's the electricity coming from? Well, that's not their problem. They just want to get rid of coal. They don't have to worry about where the new supply is coming from. They say wind and solar. It can't be done with wind and solar. But I think it requires a long-term plan is my point. And I describe that plan in the book. Yes, sir.
What are the economic prospects of the oil shale and the oil sands, which are the largest reserves of oil between Canada and in the world?
Yeah, there are probably, go ahead, anything?
And also, you mentioned the transition to a different type of energy. What types of transitions, what types of energy innovation do you think the forms will it take?
Right, good. I think with respect to unconventional oil, there are more than 1 trillion barrels in Canada, in the oil sands of Alberta, more than 1 trillion barrels in Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, in the oil shale of the Piceance Basin. And there's more than 1 trillion barrels in Venezuela, in what's called Venezuela heavy oil. This is unconventional in that it's not liquid. It's either solid, rock solid, or semi-rock solid. So there have to be different technologies to get it out. The price point is probably just under $100 or just over $100 a barrel, which is not that far from where we've been. It's a producible commodity that could be developed if we choose to. Canada has chosen as a part of national strategy to develop the oil sands of Alberta. That's happening as we speak. I think there are over 3 million barrels a day now being produced in the sands. We could do that in Colorado, except we're not, because we're not allowed, the industry's not allowed to. It's beginning to happen in Venezuela because the government is behind it. The government has to be behind things. With respect to the new forms of energy, I give great credence to another 100 years of nuclear. We have the uranium. It is the most powerful form of energy that we could imagine producing. And so why we don't develop that and safely manage it along with the waste is a mystery to me. But I also give great credence to wind and solar, particularly solar, within the next 30 to 50 years. Not now. Today's solar farms are a waste of money. And without taxpayer subsidies, they would not be built. And when I say taxpayer subsidies, coal is subsidized by taxpayers today still to the tune of 25 cents a megawatt hour. A megawatt hour. That's a lot of electricity. 25 cents a megawatt hour. In 2008, solar was subsidized $23 and 30 some odd cents a megawatt hour. Taxpayer subsidy. And it's very inefficient. Some of it is single digit efficiency. Coal at least is 35 to 38% efficient. Solar, 8% efficient. That's not a very good investment for taxpayers. But I have a great belief that the science of nanotechnology will create molecular material that we don't know exists. We will create it. And those new molecular materials will extract more energy from the sun to produce electricity. So I'm a big fan of future of solar. Wind is a nice variable energy, very expensive, but it's variable. You need some kind of backup for wind. We don't know how to store electricity. And I don't know where the technology is going on storage because we've been talking about it for 100 years. And there are no new breakthroughs on storing electricity in the near term, which means in the next decade. But we'll keep working on it, I'm sure, because we're curious. Geothermal, I think, is an opportunity, but we need new materials because it's so hot to produce electricity from geothermal energy, which is energy under the earth. I think hydrogen is an understated opportunity for us, where hydrogen, the most abundant molecule on Earth, could be valuable. Natural gas, there's plenty of natural gas, so we could continue to use natural gas. We could liquefy natural gas. We could transport natural gas. And so I think natural gas plays a role as well. That's just a few. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
What about fusion?
What about
fusion?
Fusion is beyond my technical knowledge or understanding. Fission is hard enough for me to understand. I think, as some cynical people say to me, fusion has great promise and always will. And I don't know. Beyond that, I really don't have much to say about it.
That
Yes.
fleet of tankers that cleaned up 85% of the Saudi Arabian spill. I saw some guy on TV the other night saying that was the obvious solution to this Gulf problem. What's in the way of that? I mean, where are the tankers?
I've heard
What's in them now?
I've heard three explanations for why we haven't brought the super tankers into use. I was on Dylan Radigan earlier today, and he and I talked about it on air. And he brought up two reasons why it's not being used. One is the super tankers are all full of oil waiting for the price to go up. So there's none available. That was one reason. The second reason was, according to Dylan, was that BP has said that there's so much commotion and so much confusion around where the drill site is, they just don't have space for super tankers to come along and soak up the crude. And I said, well, the oil is not around where their drill rig was, it's everywhere else. So send the super tankers everywhere else. And then I said on the show that I think I'm being cynical when I say this, but I think we suffer from bureaucracy that has a not invented here syndrome, that because it's somebody else's idea, not their idea, they don't want to take the risk of failure to experiment with something they've never done before and possibly be embarrassed in the process. But getting approval, getting agreement, getting decisions through the bureaucracy has all been impossible. Bobby Jindal has been trying for weeks to get approval to build sand berms. He can't get anybody to decide it. I've been promoting the super tankers, and Nick Posey was the person you might have seen, who's the engineer who approached me. He's been on TV a few times. We've been trying for 3 weeks to get somebody to listen to this idea. And so I worry that we are so locked into our behavior patterns, and the bureaucracy being what it is, we can't get through.
What does BP think of that idea?
Well, they finally agreed to look at it last Thursday.
Yeah.
And so conversations took place over the weekend to look seriously at the option, to look at the technical prospects of doing it. I don't think they've made a decision yet.
Because they could circumvent their
Yes.
American bureaucracy if they...
But it's logistically challenging. Where do you get the super tankers? Where do you get the equipment to, take on the oil? What port of call do you dump this water and oil into? How do you manage the process of doing all of this? Who pays for it, et cetera? So these are all questions that I think they have answers if you're determined to go make it happen.
John, thank you very much. The book can be purchased over here. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.